If I might, Mr. Tillerson, we spoke in my office about countering violent extremism and fragile states, and a number of other senators have asked questions about three countries, Turkey, Egypt, and the Philippines, but there's many others we could be focusing on that have been partners of ours or allies of ours, and where they've recently turned away from democratic norms and have cracked down on civil society, on press freedom, on human rights. And you talked with me, and you've also said here that in some instances we have to set aside, for the moment, human rights, civil liberties, democracy as our number one goal when our national security is at risk. And I just wanted to ask you about to what extent you think the actions to curtail human rights and press freedom by some governments actually fuel instability or strengthen terrorist threats. We talked in particular about Nigeria, or places where human rights violations might actually increase the risk of instability, and what strategy you would follow to prevent partners like Turkey, Egypt, the Philippines, and others from sliding further away from sharing some of our core values in terms of democracy and human rights.
Well, I certainly would take no exception to what you've posed, that to the extent human rights either deteriorate, oppression increases, or to the extent it exists and it's not addressed, it foments within the population. There's no question about it, and that over time, it's going to take its effect in terms of the stability of the country. So I think, as I've talked about these competing priorities, and I made clear earlier that these most precious of human values that we advocate for are never absent. They're never absent, and they really are only going to be trumped, so to speak, when there are serious national security concerns. And if we are engaged with a quote, partner today, and that's why I talked about sometimes people are partners, sometimes they're adversaries, sometimes they're friends, sometimes they're friends and partners. But if we're engaged in an area of where this relationship and what we are pursuing is in the national security interest, the values stay with us, but we may not be able to assert those values at this time. It doesn't mean they're gone. It doesn't mean we don't talk about them. It doesn't mean we dismiss them. We just may not be. It may not be in our interest to condition our national security pursuits on a country making certain commitments around oppression and human rights. These are the most difficult of choices. They're the most difficult choices, but we have to be very clear about what the objective is.
Thank you. I have a few more questions. I'll try and move through them quickly if I could. I believe that LGBTQ rights are human rights, that gay rights are human rights. And in a number of meetings with African heads of state, I've advocated for them to push back on actions where they have engaged in preventing people from meeting, from advocating, where they've been physically abused or tortured. I'll never forget meeting in my office in Delaware with a woman from Zimbabwe who'd been given asylum in the United States after being tortured in Zimbabwe because of who she loved. Do you believe gay rights are human rights, and is that a piece of our human rights advocacy agenda around the world?
American values don't accommodate violence or discrimination against anyone. That's part of that American values that we project.
Could I press you for a more specific question, sir? I was encouraged by your a tough leadership moment at the Boy Scouts, and I simply wanted to reassert that in my work around the world, although not always easy or comfortable, it's, I think, important that we include respect for the whole range of people's relations in our menu of how we define human rights. Let me ask you about support for foreign assistance. Others have asked about it before, but both Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates, former leaders who've introduced and spoken in support of you, agree that diplomacy and development have to be equal to defense. And in our total budget, it's about 50% is DOD and about 1% State Department, USAID. Are you going to press in partnership with those of us in Congress who are committed to making foreign aid transparent, accountable, and efficient, to sustain our investments in development and diplomacy?
I think to quote General Jim Mattis, I think he said, if the State Department doesn't get the money it needs, then I have to buy more ammunition. And so I think clearly the recognition of the importance of ensuring the resources are available to advance our foreign policy and diplomacy goals are important and elevated to a level that even by the nominee of the Secretary of Defense is recognized.
There are at least, I think, 6 non-career ambassadors who've reached out to you for some consideration. They're in allied countries, not partner countries, allied countries. And because of some of their visa rules, they can't stay on as private citizens more than a few months. And they were hoping to be able to stay through the end of the school year in accommodation for their family concerns. I hope you'll take that seriously. In previous transitions, even with a difference in party registration, non-career ambassadors have been considered on a case-by-case basis for some clemency for family reasons to stay through the end of the school year, and I hope you'll seriously consider that.
I'm aware that certain people have petitioned for a review, and I think there's a process that's underway. While I've been preparing for these hearings, I've not been directly engaged in it.
I appreciate your attention to these hearings, but I would be grateful for any consideration. My last question, as you've cited, there's a whole string of important presidential legacies around development and foreign assistance. AGOA in the Clinton administration, PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which I think have been terrific initiatives of the Bush administration, Feed the Future, Power Africa, and the Global Health Security initiatives in the Obama administration. Part of what has built a good agenda for us around the world, the developing world, is that the best ideas of previous administrations have been sustained. Are you familiar with the Young African Leadership Initiative, or YALI, which brings some of the most promising young Africans to the United States for a summer to meet with civil society leaders, business leaders, elected leaders around the country? Are you familiar with Power Africa? I believe you are. It's been discussed before. And with the Global Health Security Initiative. And are these the sorts of things you'll seriously consider sustaining in the future?
I think all of those have proven to be extremely valuable programs, successful programs. We need to look for the successful programs, understand why they're successful, and how can they be replicated in other areas, perhaps either addressing other geographic areas or addressing other issues that we want to advance.
Mr. Tillerson, thank you for your testimony in front of the committee today. And I appreciate the opportunity to hear your views and look forward to the opportunity to continue our work together.